Biographical Bytes from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, number 47 for mid-August 2025. Sara Louisa Oberholtzer, Philadelphia and Thrift.
Stony plots that are covered with thorn. Who are these days at peace? Who are these days at peace? Who are these days at peace? Who are these days at peace?
Welcome to the mid-August 2025 47th episode of Biographical Bytes from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories. Laurel Hill West is an active and historic cemetery in Bala-Kidwood, Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. I am Dr. Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine from Temple University, amateur historian, volunteer tour guide, volunteer podcaster, and volunteer author, for that matter. I'm recording this on August 14th, 2025. Laurel Hill West opened in 1869. It's across the river and upstream from its sister cemetery, Laurel Hill East in Philadelphia. It is more than twice as big as Laurel Hill East, and it has a totally different feel, a strikingly different population. As I pointed out before, Laurel Hill East is Victorian, Civil War. Laurel Hill West is Edwardian, Great War. Now, like Laurel Hill East, it is open 365 days a year, now from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Lots of parking at the business office, at the conservatory and bell tower. Another possibility, just come in while you're walking the Kidwood Trail. This episode, the mid-August 2025 podcast, discusses a woman who oversaw school savings programs that involved millions of American students in the early 20th century. Sara Louisa Vickers, a Philadelphia abolitionist and feminist, married and became Sara Oberholtzer. She is often regarded as a counterpart to Benjamin Franklin in terms of her contributions to thrift and the city of Philadelphia. Let's hear about Thrift and Sara. Sara Louise Vickers Oberholtzer, 1841-1930, Philadelphia and Thrift. Now, ask anyone, what Philadelphian do you associate with the word thrift, and the split-second answer will be Benjamin Franklin, as one of the country's founding fathers. That's a term, by the way, that was not used until 1916, founding fathers. But many of Benjamin Franklin's writings emphasize the virtues of industry and thrift, particularly in his autobiography and in some of his essays. One of his better-known maxims, beware of little expenses, a small leak will sink a great ship. Franklin practiced what he preached. He often advocated for education and self-improvement rather than spending money on frivolities. His virtues of industry included temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, humility, and chastity. Well, there have been rumors that swirled around Benjamin Franklin for many years that he was a womanizer and had somewhere between 13 and 80 illegitimate children. That rumor is not true. The only confirmed illegitimate son is William Franklin. The phrase commonly associated with Franklin, "a penny saved is a penny earned," is why Thrift Week begins each year on January 17th, which is his birthday. Americans have taken Franklin's phrase to heart. If you visit his gravestone at the walled Christ Church burial grounds, 5th and Arch Street, there is an iron fence next to the Franklin plot that allows 24-hour access, so people constantly throw pennies, and sometimes nickels and dimes, onto his tombstone. Occasionally, the layer of coins is so thick you cannot read his inscription. And over the past 2 centuries, the accumulation of millions of episodes of micro-trauma to the stone has contributed to its large visible cracks. Let's see, each year, Christ Church collects somewhere between $4,000 and $5,000 worth of pennies. Let's see, it's 2.5 grams per penny, 500,000 pennies for $5,000. That is 1,250 kilograms of pennies. It's about 1.5 tons. No wonder the gravestone is cracked. Franklin practiced a combination of thrift and frugality. Although the two terms are sometimes used interchangeably, they do have distinct meanings. Thrift refers to the careful management of resources, especially money. Thrift emphasizes saving and using resources wisely to ensure long-term financial stability. Investing and saving for the future is essential. You thrive to be thrifty. Frugality, on the other hand, can be a one-shot deal. It means efficient management of time, energy, other resources, often focusing on minimal spending and avoiding waste. Thrift is a lifestyle about the long-term benefits of saving and investing. Thrift expands beyond money. It can include managing time, being thrifty with your time, energy, other resources. Frugality often focuses on immediate savings, short-term benefits, using coupons, buying secondhand, using public transportation instead of buying a car. Now, the emergence of secondhand stores, so-called thrift shops, has become so ubiquitous that the term thrift has become a verb. Let's go thrifting. This has become part of our vocabulary and also part of frugality. Yet the story of thrift in America is far richer and more varied than Franklin's legacy alone. From the parables of Aesop, think of the ant and the grasshopper, where industry prepares for lean times and carelessness leads to ruin, to the didactic tales inscribed in school books a century ago. Thrift has been celebrated, debated, and sometimes even subverted in popular culture. The values attached to thrift has appeared in everything from proverbs and fables to school curricula and civic rituals. Throughout the centuries, American attitudes towards thrift reflected the ever-changing tides of national optimism and hardship. In the post-Civil War era, as the nation rebuilt and expanded, thrift became both a moral ideal and a practical necessity. Movements arose to encourage savings among children and adults alike. In times of crisis, like the Great Depression or the World Wars, thrift was elevated from a private virtue to a patriotic duty, as citizens were urged to conserve resources, buy war bonds, plant victory gardens. The language of thrift became woven into daily life, its virtues extolled in everything from advertising campaigns to community savings initiatives. And yet, Americans have always found ways to question or even satirize the notion of thrift. Humorists and critics, Ambrose Bierce among them, have poked fun at the sanctimonious side of penny pinching. In one of Bierce's stories from Fantastic Fable, when the ant asked the grasshopper why it didn't make any stocks, it replied that it actually did, but then the ants broke in and took it all away. The line between prudent economy and joyless miserliness has never been entirely clear. Makes thrift a fertile ground for both earnest advice and sly subversion. The Bible contains numerous teachings that encourage thrift. Proverbs 21:20 says, "The wise store up choice food and olive oil, but fools gulp theirs down." The Quran advises against extravagance and encourages moderation. Judaism teaches the principle of Bal Tashit, or Do Not Destroy, which encourages careful use of resources and avoidance of waste. Buddhism teaches the middle way, which advocates a balanced life, which avoids both excess and deficiency. In Hinduism, the concept of aparigraha, or non-possessiveness, encourages people to live simply. In 1816, Philadelphia had its first savings bank, the Philadelphia Saving Fund Society, PSFS. Along with other savings banks established during the 19th century, PSFS encouraged Philadelphians to save money for mortgages and retirement and provide a form of economic insurance in case of debilitating illness or the death of a family's primary wage earner. This form of institutional savings became popular in the Philadelphia region, where 3 other savings fund societies formed by 1853, and then in other northeastern states, where nearly 600 saving banks were in operation by 1930. The PSFS building with its iconic red sign on the roof did not come along until 1932. It was the first modern skyscraper in the United States. If asked to identify the Philadelphia woman most closely associated with Thrift, many might not immediately recognize Sara Louisa Oberholtzer. I first encountered her legacy while I was preparing an audio tour along the Kenwood Heritage Trail a couple of years ago. The Kenwood Heritage Trail cuts through Laurel Hill West for, I'm going to say, a half mile, maybe a little more than a half a mile. It exits at the Pencoid Landing. Well, it exits over on Writers Ferry Road and then feeds down to the Pencoid Landing and the pedestrian bridge that crosses the Schuylkill River into Philadelphia. While I was investigating, I discovered the Oberholtzer family plot. It's located at the end of the Ginkgo Alley up the road from the Barmouth entrance on the left-hand side. They are slightly downhill from the resting place of Cyrus Curtis of Curtis Publishing Company and across the street from Cough Drop King William Loudon and Hall of Fame golfer Glenna Collette Vare. My preliminary research a few years ago showed Oberholtzer's efforts in assisting school children to establish savings accounts. Well, that sounded interesting and prompted my decision that she would be in a podcast in the future. As I organized this year's programs late last year, I scheduled her for mid-August, together with her son, an accomplished historian and an author who's also in the family plot. I thought I'd put Ellis Paxton Oberholtzer together with his mother. The son has to wait. Sarah's story is big enough that she gets an episode of her own. Now, pre-publication copies of my book arrived last Monday. All bones considered, 52 Laurel Hill women. It took up a few days of my time. I visited local libraries, universities, set up some speaking engagements, and I didn't get around to researching Sara until a few days ago. I found an article from the November 2012 edition of Pennsylvania Legacies. It was written by Andrew L. Yarrow, called Sara Oberholtzer and the School Savings Bank Movement. That's exactly what I needed. I found Professor Yarrow online. I informed him of my intent to use his article as the basis of the podcast, and his response was, "Thank you for contacting me. Please do use anything you would like from my article about Sara Oberholtzer or my book Thrift 2015, which devotes a section to her story. If you could send a link to your podcast, I would appreciate it." So, much of what I tell you from this point on until I say otherwise is going to come directly from Dr. Yarrow's article. I modified it a little bit to make it easier on the speaking voice instead of reading. And I did buy a copy of his book Thrift to donate to our cemetery library. So here we go. I'm going to read you an article. Sara Oberholtzer and the School Savings Bank Movement by Andrew L. Yarrow, Pennsylvania Legacies, Volume 12, Number 2, November 2012. On the eve of the Great Depression, more than 4 million American school children, or about 1 in 6 K-12 students, had savings accounts in school-based banks. The prevalence of school savings banks whose popularity grew enormously during the decade after the United States entered the Great War, is all the more remarkable when one considers that very few adult Americans had bank accounts at the end of the 19th century, and that school savings banks are virtually unknown in the 21st century. Well, not only were millions of school children depositors in the 1920s, but their involvement with school savings banks entailed elaborate weekly rituals, which was integrated with classroom instructions on money management and the broader concept of thrift. Thrift was more than just saving money. To its many early 20th century proponents, it meant wise spending, conservation of resources, elimination of waste, moderation, self-control, and careful use of time. Typically every Monday when roll was called in the 15,000 schools that had savings banks by the late 1920s, each student would deposit a few pennies or more, and the amount would be recorded on his or her bank card, which bore the names of the student, the teacher, and the school. Bank cards also carried a motto such as, "The habit of saving is an essential part of a true practical education." Teachers collected their pupils' deposits in an envelope and forwarded them to the principal, who then sent all classrooms' deposits to a cooperating local savings bank. Records were initially kept on a card, a little index card, but after a student's deposits reached a certain threshold, it was usually when they hit $1, they would get a bank book. And then when they reached another milestone, generally $3, the student would start to earn 3% interest. And children could withdraw money by writing a check if it was co-signed either by a parent or a principal. At the end of each month, students brought their bank books home to show their parents. This is absolutely brilliant. That's my comment. The importance of saving and the meanings of thrift were also impressed upon students from kindergarten through high school through textbooks, pamphlets, and other materials developed by educators, bankers, and moral reformers. The lessons of thrift were a part of students' general instruction, imparted in classes such as English, mathematics, history, geography. In many states, beginning with Massachusetts in 1911, thrift education was a curriculum requirement. Why did school savings banks proliferate and thrift education flourish during the early 20th century, particularly between the 1910s and 20s? What values and ideas undergirded this movement? What were its goals? Who were its leaders? What impact did the movement have, and why did it peter out? And what relevance does it have for 21st century America? School savings banks, like the broader thrift movements of which it was part, were supported by an unlikely coalition of moral crusaders, progressive-era reformers, bankers, educators, and government officials. Many believed that instruction in the ideas and habits of thrift was critical for character education that would produce more responsible, independent, selfless, and generous citizens. Some advocates saw teaching thrift as an antidote to poverty and radicalism. Others saw it as a way to civilize the lower classes, drawn to drink and gaudy amusements, and to Americanize the millions of new Eastern and Southern European immigrants by integrating them into the nation's economy. A common argument in support of thrift education was that Americans were especially profligate and spendthrift in comparison to Europeans. Some advocates were driven by revulsion toward the emerging consumer society and its extravagance. Others drew connections between savings and capital accumulation that would foster larger economic growth. And still others saw the virtues of thrift as being of a piece with the conservation movement that opposed the destruction of forests and the waste of natural resources. One of the most ardent apostles of school banking was a leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, Sara Louisa Oberholtzer. A Philadelphia WCTU activist between the 1890s and the 1910s, Oberholtzer declared that the goals of the school savings bank movement were no less than the, quote, inculcation of the principles of thrift, honesty, and self-responsibility, the upbuilding through the schools of prosperity and stability for home and state, the improvement of the organic, social, and economical conditions under which we live, the moral and financial welfare of the nation. For Oberholtzer, thrift could help solve many of the social problems roiling late 19th century America: inequality, poverty, criminality, drunkenness, and the decline of character and good citizenship. Oberholtzer inveighed against, quote, the unequal distribution of wealth, which results in great wealth and abject poverty, and called for the diffused possession of property. To her, the remedy was instruction in thrift. In one of her earliest writings on the subject, A Plea for Economic Teaching, 1889, she argued, what we need most as a nation to distribute the wealth of our country properly is a general knowledge of economy and thrift. In a 1907 WCTU pamphlet, Oberholtzer explained school savings banks as, quote, a plan for collecting and taking care of school children's pennies and at the same time teaching the children habits of thrift and individual responsibility of possession, use, and distribution. When she was appointed National Superintendent of the new School Savings Bank Division of the WCTU in 1890, Oberholtzer expressed her belief in the far-reaching benefits of thrift. We all know that thrift and industry are the strong backbones of an individual as well as of a nation, and that in every country the frugal and industrious will always rise among his mates above the ordinary scale of morality and happiness. Lack of industry and economy is the greatest cause of poverty, crime, vice, pauperism, and intemperance. The lazy and spendthrift land on a barren coast. In subsequent writings and speeches, she declared that thrift in general and school savings banks in particular would promote purer lives, independence, self-reliance, and manliness. Although their greatest period of growth was in the 1920s, school savings banks first appeared in the United States during the late 19th century. John H. Thiry, that's Thiry spelled like 30 without the second T, Thiry. He was a Belgian immigrant, widely credited with founding the first such bank in a school in Long Island City, New York in 1885. Now, before he came to America, Thiry had gotten the idea for school banks at the 1873 Vienna Exposition, where he learned about savings programs in French and other European schools. The first European school savings banks had been established in Gauchard, Germany in 1820 and Le Mans, France in 1834. The banks flourished in France after that country's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War led to an emphasis on building national savings. And by 1886, 23,000 French schools had savings banks. Similar programs had emerged from England, Scandinavia, Italy, Russia, all throughout Europe. Thiry saw school savings banks as a way to develop character and combat poverty among the working class. Working tirelessly to promote the cause, Thiry's efforts were in line with those of other 19th century reformers who established savings banks and building and loan associations for the poor. These institutions were seen as a means for the lower classes to better themselves by learning the virtues of hard work, thrift, and self-control. Many moral reformers considered self-help a preferable mode of alleviating poverty to charity or more radical social change. Given these beliefs, it is not surprising that the cause of school savings banks was adopted by the temperance movement. Temperance advocates saw thrift and sobriety as mutually reinforcing forms of self-control, and WCTU President Francis Willard urged that children be given early the simplest lessons in thrift and responsibility. Sara Oberholtzer, a journalist, poet, and anti-tobacco crusader, who was introduced to the idea of school savings banks at an 1888 meeting of the American Economic Association, became the leading proponent of school savings banks during the subsequent 2 decades. She viewed these banks as the best preventative against, quote, waste, want, crime, intemperance, and general unrest. Oberholtzer published countless pamphlets, distributing them by the tens of thousands, as well as a quarterly magazine, Thrift Tidings, which she edited from 1907 to 1923. This slender publication included updates about school savings banks around the country. You can find numerous issues of Thrift Tidings online at archive.org. She carefully chronicled the movement's growth, recording the number of student participants and the savings accumulated in dozens of communities. According to her precise reports, the number of student depositors increased from about 28,000 in 1891 to 400,000 in 1915. Oberholtzer offered rewards to states with the most banks and the largest number of meetings explaining school savings banks. In the magazine, she also told stories of how money saved by children benefited individuals and communities. In one case, school saving banks deposits helped fund the building of a church. In another, $80 enabled a boy who had lost a leg to buy a wooden one. Just feel-good stories. Thrift Tidings typically opened with a paragraph of Oberholtzer's homespun philosophy. The April 1909 issue, for example, begins, "In order that thrift and prosperity abound, it is necessary that people understand the practical use of time and money." Oberholtzer wrote how-to manuals for schools that wished to develop banks and composed poems and songs such as "Save Your Pennies" and "A School Savings Rally." At least 50,000 copies of one pamphlet, How to Institute a School Savings Bank, 1913, were distributed. She also spoke at national and international conferences, won over government leaders in the U.S. Bureau of Education, which published her 1914 essay on school savings banks, and told stories of trekking 15 miles in a day to interest additional schools. In a poem entitled "The Browns," Oberholtzer wrote, "We owe our knowledge to the schools, the Browns in chorus say. If any don't teach savings banks, they're quite behind the day." Now, by the late 1910s, Oberholtzer had been joined by many others who worked to develop and expand thrift education in the schools. S.W. Strauss, the creator of commercial real estate mortgage bonds that financed many of the early skyscrapers in America, adopted thrift as his cause. He cajoled the National Education Association to make it one of its as well. The NEA created a committee on thrift education in 1915, which conducted national student essay contests and compiled materials for use in classroom instruction. The 1917-18 contest, this is right in the middle of the Great War, they had 100,000 entries in this contest. Writers began to fill the growing market for child-oriented thrift books. Myron Pritchard and Grace Turkington wrote stories of thrift for young Americans. Indeed, by the time of America's entry into the Great War, Sara Oberholtzer acknowledged that everyone seemed to be promoting thrift. She called her Thrift Tidings a pioneer that long predated the thousands and thousands of thrift and saving pamphlets, books, leaflets, posters, plans, and papers published by government, bankers, philanthropists, and educators. 5 years later, in a final issue of her magazine, Oberholtzer wistfully wrote that Thrift Tidings, the humble carrier of the coming of school savings banks, is not especially needed now, because the natural forces have heard and heeded, and the thrift teaching has proved of such value it is being so widely taken up. The American Bankers Association, ABA, began to advocate for school banks in the 1910s, and by early 1920 they had supplanted the WCTU and other moral reformers as the movement's prime driver. W.S.B. Albig, who headed the ABA's Savings Bank Division, hailed school saving banks for their rapidly expanding number of depositors and for teaching economic principles that would make, quote, life richer and more abundant. Albig and many of his ABA associates were ever cognizant of the fact that working with children would burnish the image of bankers. Teachers, school officials, and parent-teacher associations also eagerly subscribed to the idea that school banks and teaching thrift were essential for national betterment. The NEA called for compulsory thrift education and promoted the development of thrift curricula. To NEA leaders, thrift education necessarily included lessons in economics and money management, as well as moral instruction in self-denial, generosity, and other values. School savings banks flourished during the 1920s. As many as 150 different organizations became involved in the movement, as national NEA conferences on thrift education in the mid-1920s were attended by representatives of groups as disparate as the ABA, the General Federation of Women's Clubs, the Congress of Parents and Teachers, the American Federation of Labor, the American Library Association, the Chamber of Commerce, the American Home Economics Association, the YMCA and YWCA, the National Catholic Welfare Council, the Jewish Welfare Board, the National Parks Service, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Some cities, like Duluth, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, San Francisco, claimed nearly universal student participation, and Los Angeles and other districts appointed superintendents of school savings. In 1926, the Wall Street Journal reported with undue precision that the number of participating pupils had risen by 635.7% since 1920. There were about 15,000 school savings bank programs and 4.2 million depositors by 1929. And we know what happened in 1929. This was the high water mark of the school savings bank movement. Distrust of banks and economic hard times caused the school saving banks to decline during the 1930s. During World War II, school banks were mobilized by the Federal Schools at War program and the ABA to get children to buy war stamps and bonds. And by 1947, there were still 3,500 school banks that existed, fewer than one-fourth the number before the Depression. After the war, the Treasury continued its school savings program, and the Federal Bureau of Education maintained its school savings bank unit, but school banks declined precipitously during the 1960s, partly a function of the emphasis on consumption during those boom years, and partly a result of banks' waning interest. The school savings bank movement reached millions of students in the early 20th century. Whether it led them to become lifelong savers or wise spenders is open to debate. Like the broader thrift movement, school savings banks faced strong headwinds from an emerging consumer society in the 1920s, and even more so after World War II, as the banking industry gained the upper hand in shaping what was still known as thrift education in the 1920s, and was later called economic education in the 1950s and 60s, and financial literacy in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The values of thrift became secondary to economic and consumer proficiency. Money management took precedence over values such as self-control, conservation, and generosity. Nonetheless, Sara Oberholtzer's advocacy on behalf of school savings banks in the early 20th century touched millions of students. While the bank's techniques may seem quaint, many of the principles they taught have renewed relevance today as American savings have plummeted and debts have risen, as calls for greater personal and environmental responsibility have grown louder, and as many have become dissatisfied with the values of consumer culture. Perhaps the time has come for a more holistic and more sophisticated renewal of thrift education. Pause. That was an almost verbatim reading of Sara Oberholtzer and the School Savings Bank Movement from Pennsylvania Legacies, Volume 12, Number 2, November 2012. And I took a little bit of information out of the revised episode, which went into the book Thrift, The History of an American Cultural Movement. This was Chapter 4, Teaching Thrift in Schools. Both of those by scholar Andrew L. Yarrow. Again, Dr. Yarrow, I thank you ever so much for giving me permission to use this material. You saved me many hours of research. But I'm not done with Sara, because all I talked about was her savings. Remember, she was a poet. She was a Quaker. She was an abolitionist. Sara Louisa Vickers. She was born in Euclid Township, Pennsylvania. If you're not from around Philadelphia, Euclid is Uwchlan. I promise you, if you don't live around here, you wouldn't pronounce it right the first time. She was born in Euclid Township on May 20th, 1841. Daughter of Quakers Ann T. and Paxson Vickers. The family were active abolitionists. They assisted hundreds of fugitives on their way to Canada. Among the guests in their homes were the famed abolitionists John G. Whittier, Lucretia Mott, William Lloyd Garrison, Bayard Taylor. Sara was educated at Thomas's Friends Boarding School, the State Normal School in Millersville, and also by private tutors. She started to write for newspapers and magazines when she was 18. And at that time, she was already president of a Soldiers' Aid Society, which rendered assistance to the Union Army during the Civil War. She had strongly considered studying medicine, but ill health interfered with her medical course of studies. On January 1st, 1862, a couple of months before the war started, she married John Oberholtzer of Norristown, Pennsylvania. He was the chief miller at the mill at Anselma in Chester County, and this soon inspired many of her poems. Who dares not pause amid the throng of color, fragrance, joy, and song? They lived in Chester County, Pennsylvania until 1883, with a summer residence in Longport, New Jersey. Their children were Ellis Paxson Oberholtzer and Vickers Oberholtzer. Ellis was known in the world of letters as an editor, economist, historian, and biographer. So, yes, he will get his own podcast one day, separate from his mother's. Sara was president of the Anti-Tobacco Society. She organized it in 1881. She was president of the Longport Agassiz Microscopial Society. Well, she organized that one in 1884. The aforementioned Soldiers' Aid Society, the World's Women's Christian Temperance Union, the National Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Pennsylvania Women's Press Association, 1903 to 1905, and superintendent of the School Savings Bank of Pennsylvania. Her first published book was Violet Lee and Other Poems, Philadelphia, 1873, with the dedication to my beloved brother, T.L. Vickers, playmate of my childhood and staunch friend of my riper years. Let's see, 1873. I guess she was 32 years old by then. I affectionately dedicate this volume. Next was Come for Arbutus and Other Wild Bloom, Philadelphia, 1882. Hope's Heart's Bells, Philadelphia, 1883. Daisies of Verse, Philadelphia, 1886, and Souvenirs of Occasions, Philadelphia, 1892. They consisted mostly of poems that the author read on public occasions. Several of her poems were set to music by different composers. Among those, the best known is probably the Bayard Taylor Burial Ode, which is sung as Pennsylvania's tribute to her dead poet at his funeral service in Longwood in March of 1889, and also Under the Flowers, a decoration ode. She wrote extensively for periodicals and magazines on economic subjects, biography, travel, ornithology. She was a birder. And she did considerable local reporting. She was the author of numerous dialogues and charades. She was an amateur oologist, an egg collector, listed in catalogues of naturalists, and had one of the finest private collections of Australian bird skins and bird eggs in the United States. Well, after Sara exchanged letters with fellow poet John Greenleaf Whittier, they became fast friends. She also sent Henry Wadsworth Longfellow some of her work, and they too struck up a long-distance friendship. The quality of her poetry was better than doggerel, but not by much. She introduced one of her poetry volumes with this ditty: "As violets come with springtime, this rhythm came to me. Not strong, mayhap, or holy, but as the sunshine, free. My friends, for you I've gathered this bunch of humble bloom, trusting it will o'er some life exhale a faint perfume. I pray you take it kindly, nor think I deem it rare, only a span of violets thrown on the passing air." Sara Oberholtzer was one of the first speakers at the first meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington, D.C., 1890. She also spoke at the World's Congress of Women in Chicago in 1893 at the exposition, at the Geneva, Switzerland meeting in 1903, and numerous other international meetings. She aided in instituting the University Extension movement. She died February 2nd, 1930, and was interred at Laurel Hill West. The bulk of her estate went to her son. But her name deserves to be remembered as the female Benjamin Franklin, the woman who made children save their pennies for many years during the early 20th century. Sara Louisa Oberholtzer, buried at Laurel Hill West. In the September 2025 episode of All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 77, it's Look Up in the Sky. It's about some early pilots who were buried at Laurel Hill. Now, I already talked about Pancho Barnes way back in All Bones Considered quarantine special. She's not there. Pancho was cremated, so she is not at Laurel Hill with her grandparents. Now you get to hear about Major Holger Juarez. That's Holger, H-O-L-G-E-R, Juarez, H-O-I-R-I-S-S. He was a stunt pilot whose nickname was, of course, Hold Your Horses. Then there's Gebhard and Maria Harris, H-A-R-R-E-S, who were the maternal grandparents of Amelia Earhart. Benjamin Lee II was a pilot who went down during the Great War. Lieutenant Colonel George Wilson Grove was killed in action with the Royal Air Force during World War II. And cabaret singer Anne Francine's brother, Jacques-Louis Francine, was presented with a Distinguished Flying Cross with clusters for his heroism during World War II. I hope that September's Biographical Bytes from Bala, Laurel Hill West stories, will be about a larger-than-life Philadelphia lawyer named John Fow, who had two nicknames that make him worthy of investigation. He was called Ducky for the way he walked and Foghorn for the way he talked. That will be in September. Now, for upcoming activities and tours, go to the website. It's laurelhillphl.com/events. The big one, well, there's two big ones in September. No, the big one in September is the Rocky Horror Picture Show. It's on Friday, September 5th. You can go to a cemetery and you can see the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and you can see live reenactors at the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I give a Sacred Spaces tour. That's at Laurel Hill West on the 11th. The book is out. All Bones Considered, 52 Laurel Hill Women. If you have listened to every edition of the podcast, you have listened to the book. I took the scripts from 52 of the women that I've covered in this podcast. Well, it's more than 52, actually, but enough for 52 chapters, and converted them into a book. And it is now available. You can buy one at the cemetery. It's in the gift shop there. Or you can pre-order from Amazon or Barnes & Noble. And I'm hoping soon it will also be available for mail order from the gift shop, the cemetery gift shop. I've got several author events already arranged. I'll be at the Market of the Macabre on September 20th. I'm doing Gladwin Library on my 78th birthday, which is September 24th. And so far in October, I've got author events at the Bala Kinwood Library, Bryn Mawr Library, and the Lower Merion Historical Society. If you are with a historical society or some other organization that you think might be interested in hearing about the book with the biographies of 52 Laurel Hill women, just get in touch with me. jrlexjr1947@gmail.com. All Bones Considered and Biographical Bytes from Bala are mostly researched, written, narrated, and produced by me, Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine from Temple University, volunteer tour guide, volunteer podcaster for both cemeteries. Reach me again through my email, jrlexjr1947@gmail.com. My theme song, Names at Peace, is by local artist James Harrow. And maybe I will see you on a cemetery tour. I've got that one coming up on the 11th that I'm giving. So stay safe, stay well, and if you want to listen, the bibliography is up next. Bibliography. There is an article by Sara Louisa Oberholtzer from the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, July 1892. It's called School Savings Banks. From 1907, there's a book called Thrift, a Book of Domestic Counsel by Samuel Smiles, LLD. I guess the publisher is Popular Edition. I don't see another publisher, but it was printed in London. Oh, there it is, John Murray, Albemarle Street, West, 1907. The Promotion of Thrift in America by Alvin Johnson. That's from the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, January 1920, volume 87. Which is called The New American Thrift, pages 233 to 238. A lot of other good information in that edition that I did not use. This was a fun article. It's called So Out It's In, The History and Revival of Thrift in America. From Thrift and Thriving in America, Capitalism and Moral Order from the Puritans to the Present by Joshua J. Yates and James Davison Hunter. This is a review of this monster book that covers all aspects of the entire thrift movement. It's from the Reviews in American History, Volume 40, Number 4, December 2012. And finally, the one that made the whole episode come together, Sara Oberholtzer and the School Savings Bank Movement by Andrew L. Yarrow. And again, I thank Andrew Yarrow for giving me permission to essentially do whatever I wanted to with this article. It's from Pennsylvania Legacies, Volume 12, Number 2. If you get the original, it's got a lot of cool pictures with it also. It's published by the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So thanks for listening. Maybe I'll see you at the cemetery. Stay safe, stay well, stay above ground.